The day I became the most hated woman in Willow Creek Estates was the day I caught my neighbor's escaped fish and got slapped with a $500 fine for unauthorized aquatic animal relocation. What started as a simple act of kindness would end with me holding the deed to half the neighborhood and watching the HOA president pack her Mercedes with boxes of shame. If you've ever dealt with a power-hungry HOA that thinks your good intentions are criminal acts, drop a comment below because this story is going to make your blood boil before it makes you cheer. I never thought I'd be the type of person to wage war against a homeowners association. Before all this started, I was Sarah Martinez, 34, a freelance marine biologist who chose Willow Creek Estates specifically because it was quiet, affordable, and had that beautiful retention pond that reminded me of the lakes I studied in graduate school. I worked from home, analyzing water samples and writing environmental impact reports for construction companies. My husband Miguel had passed away from cancer 2 years earlier, leaving me with our 7-year-old daughter Emma and a desperate need for stability and peace. Miguel had been my anchor through graduate school and early career struggles. He was a real estate attorney who specialized in property law, and he'd often joke that between his legal expertise and my environmental science background, we could probably run our own town. After his death, I threw myself into work as a way to cope, taking on extra freelance contracts that required me to spend hours by various water sources, testing and documenting aquatic ecosystems. It was solitary work that helped me process grief while providing the income Emma and I needed. The house we found was perfect, a modest 3-bedroom ranch with a backyard that faced the pond. Emma loved watching the ducks and herons, and I loved the fact that the HOA seemed reasonable. The monthly fees were low, the rules seemed standard, and the neighborhood was filled with young families and retirees who kept to themselves. The HOA president, Karen Whitfield, had even seemed pleasant during our initial walkthrough, commenting on how nice it would be to have a science professional in the community. During that initial meeting, Karen had walked us around the property with the confidence of someone showing off their personal estate. She pointed out the community amenities with obvious pride: the perfectly manicured common areas, the spotless mailbox clusters, the pristine retention pond that she described as the crown jewel of our little paradise. She mentioned that she'd been HOA president for 4 years and took great pride in maintaining Willow Creek Estates as one of the most well-managed communities in the county. What I didn't know was that Karen Whitfield was the kind of person who viewed pleasantness as a weapon and power as her birthright. She lived in the largest house on the lake, a sprawling colonial that her late husband's insurance money had bought, and she treated the HOA presidency like her personal kingdom. Karen was the type of woman who wore pearls to grocery shop and spoke in that carefully modulated tone that made everything sound like a veiled threat. My first real interaction with Karen came 3 months after we moved in. Emma had been feeding the ducks at the pond's edge, something dozens of kids in the neighborhood did regularly. Karen appeared beside us like she'd materialized from thin air, her blonde bob perfectly styled despite the morning humidity. She informed me that feeding waterfowl was actually against HOA regulations, something about maintaining the natural ecosystem balance. I apologized and said we didn't know, expecting that to be the end of it. But Karen's smile was sharp as she explained that ignorance of the rules wasn't an excuse and that she'd be sending me a formal warning letter. For feeding ducks. With bread that cost maybe 50 cents. The warning letter arrived 2 days later, typed on official HOA letterhead with my violation carefully documented and filed. It felt excessive, but I figured Karen was just thorough. I had no idea this was her testing the waters, seeing how much pushback she'd get from the new neighbor. The real problem started with my neighbor Jake Thompson. Jake lived in the house directly next to mine, a divorced dad in his early 40s who worked as an electrician and spent his free time obsessing over his koi pond. This wasn't just any koi pond. Jake had invested thousands of dollars into a custom setup with filtration systems, UV lights, and about 30 expensive Japanese koi that he treated like beloved pets. He knew each fish by name and could tell you their breeding history, their favorite spots in the pond, and their individual personalities. Jake's dedication to his koi was something beautiful to witness. He'd wake up early every morning to check water temperatures and pH levels, spending at least an hour before work making sure his fish were healthy and happy. On weekends, his teenage son Marcus would visit, and they'd spend hours together by the pond, with Jake teaching the boy about water chemistry and fish behavior. It was clear that the koi pond was more than a hobby. It was Jake's way of creating something peaceful and meaningful after his divorce, and his main connection point with his son. Jake and I had become friendly over our shared love of aquatic life. He'd often find me in my backyard early in the morning, taking water samples from the retention pond for freelance projects, and he'd wander over with coffee to chat about pH levels and algae management. He was one of those genuinely nice guys who'd help you move furniture without being asked and who always had tools you could borrow. When Emma's bicycle chain broke, Jake appeared with his toolbox before I even thought to ask for help. One Tuesday morning in late September, I was setting up my water testing equipment when I noticed something orange and white darting around in the shallow end of the retention pond. Then I saw another one. And another. Jake's koi had somehow escaped their pond and were now swimming free in the community water feature. I immediately knocked on Jake's door. He was getting ready for work, but when I told him about the fish, he dropped everything and ran outside in his work boots and unbuttoned shirt. Sure enough, about 8 of his prized koi were now residents of the retention pond, probably having escaped during the heavy rains we'd had the night before that must have caused an overflow situation. Jake was devastated. These weren't just fish to him. They were expensive, beloved pets that he'd raised from juveniles. Some of them were worth hundreds of dollars each, and more importantly, they held sentimental value from his time bonding with his teenage son during weekend visits. The retention pond wasn't designed for koi. It was too shallow in some areas, too deep in others, and filled with native fish and turtles that could potentially harm the koi or compete for resources. Plus, the water chemistry was completely different. Jake's fish were going to die if we didn't act fast. I told Jake I'd help him catch the fish. As a marine biologist, I had experience with fish capture and relocation. I had the proper nets, containers, and knowledge to do it safely. Jake was incredibly grateful. He had to get to a job site, but he said he'd pay me back however he could. I spent the next 3 hours carefully netting Jake's koi from the retention pond. It was delicate work. These fish were stressed and skittish, and I had to make sure not to harm them while also ensuring I didn't disrupt the pond's ecosystem too much. Each fish required a different approach. Some responded well to gentle herding with a net, while others needed to be coaxed with food. I used techniques I'd learned during graduate research, moving slowly and deliberately to avoid causing additional stress to the displaced fish. The whole process reminded me of fieldwork I'd done in graduate school, except the stakes felt more personal. These weren't research subjects. They were Jake's beloved pets, some of which he'd raised from fingerlings. I could see their individual personalities as I worked. There was the bold orange and white one that seemed curious about the net, the shy black one that kept hiding under lily pads, and the large golden one that Jake had mentioned was worth over $800. I managed to rescue 7 of the 8 fish, placing them in temporary holding containers with aerators before transferring them back to Jake's repaired pond system. The 8th fish, unfortunately, seemed to have been injured during the escape and had already succumbed to the stress and unsuitable water conditions. I dreaded having to tell Jake about the loss, knowing how much each fish meant to him. Jake was devastated about losing the one fish, but incredibly grateful that I'd saved the other 7. When he got home that evening and saw his surviving fish safely back in their proper environment, he actually teared up. He told me that those fish represented years of careful breeding and thousands of dollars in investment, but more than that, they were his connection to peaceful moments in a chaotic life. He insisted on paying me for my time, but I refused. It was just the neighborly thing to do. Besides, as someone who'd spent years studying aquatic ecosystems, I knew how important it was to prevent invasive species situations, even accidental ones. Over the next few days, I checked on Jake's fish multiple times to make sure they were recovering from their ordeal. Most of them seemed to be readjusting well to their familiar environment, though a couple remained more skittish than usual. Jake was incredibly attentive to their recovery, adjusting water temperatures and monitoring their feeding behavior with the dedication of a worried parent. That's when Karen Whitfield entered the picture like a storm cloud with a clipboard. 3 days later, I found an official notice taped to my front door. It was a formal citation for unauthorized aquatic animal relocation and interference with community water features. The fine was $500, and the letter informed me that I had violated HOA Regulation 47B, which prohibited residents from removing, relocating, or otherwise disturbing any flora or fauna within community spaces without prior written approval from the HOA board. I read the letter 3 times, certain it was some kind of mistake. I had helped my neighbor retrieve his escaped pets and prevented an ecological disaster in the process. How was that a violation worth $500? I called Karen immediately. Her voice was sickeningly sweet as she explained that the rules were the rules, regardless of my intentions. She said that for all she knew, I could have been stealing fish from the pond, and that the HOA couldn't make exceptions just because I claimed to be helping a neighbor. I pointed out that Jake could verify my story, that I was a marine biologist who understood ecosystem management, and that I'd actually prevented a much bigger problem. Karen's response was that my credentials were irrelevant. I should have called the HOA first and waited for official approval before taking any action. When I asked how long that approval process would have taken, Karen said it typically required a formal written request followed by a board review, which usually took 2 to 3 weeks. I explained that Jake's fish would have died by then, and that invasive species needed to be removed immediately to prevent ecological damage. Karen's voice turned cold as she informed me that my expertise didn't supersede HOA authority, and that if I wanted to appeal the fine, I could request a hearing with the board. Until then, payment was due within 30 days. I was furious, but I figured the board hearing would sort everything out. Surely reasonable people would understand that I'd done the right thing in an emergency situation. I requested the hearing and spent 2 weeks preparing my case, gathering documentation about koi as invasive species, photos of Jake's pond setup, and testimonials from other neighbors who'd witnessed the whole situation. The hearing was held in Karen's living room, which should have been my first red flag. The board consisted of Karen and 2 other residents. Margaret Chen, an elderly retired teacher who seemed afraid to contradict Karen, and Bob Patterson, a middle-aged accountant who spent the entire hearing scrolling through his phone. I presented my case professionally and thoroughly. I explained the ecological risks of non-native fish in the retention pond, showed photos of the rescue operation, and provided Jake's written statement confirming that I'd been helping him retrieve his escaped pets. I thought I'd made a compelling argument. Karen listened with that same cold smile, taking notes on a legal pad. When I finished, she thanked me for my presentation and said the board would deliberate. Their deliberation lasted about 3 minutes, during which Margaret nodded nervously at everything Karen said and Bob never looked up from his phone. Karen announced that the board had reviewed my case and determined that the fine would stand. She said that while my intentions may have been good, I had still violated HOA regulations by taking unauthorized action in community spaces. She added that as a professional, I should have known better than to act without proper approval. But then Karen went further. She said that given my pattern of rule violations, referring to the duck feeding incident, the board was implementing additional restrictions. I was now prohibited from entering community water features for any reason, including my freelance water testing work. Any future violations would result in escalating fines and potential legal action. I sat there in stunned silence as Karen smiled that awful smile and handed me an official notice of the decision. She just destroyed my ability to work from home and paint me as some kind of repeat offender, all because I'd helped my neighbor and fed some ducks. Jake was horrified when I told him what happened. He immediately offered to pay the fine himself and even went to Karen's house to explain the situation. Karen told him that while she appreciated his support for his neighbor, the HOA's decision was final and that residents needed to learn to follow proper procedures. That's when Jake let slip something that changed everything. He mentioned that he'd seen Karen's own landscaping crew removing algae and debris from the retention pond just 2 weeks earlier, without any visible HOA approval process. Karen went silent for a moment, then told Jake that maintenance issues were different from resident actions and that she didn't appreciate his tone. Jake came back fuming. He'd realized what I was starting to understand. This wasn't about rules or procedures. This was about Karen flexing her power and punishing me for some perceived slight. Maybe it was because I was new, maybe it was because I had credentials that made her feel threatened, or maybe she just didn't like that I'd acted independently without asking her permission first. I paid the fine because I had to. As a single mother with a mortgage and a daughter to support, I couldn't risk legal action or escalating penalties. But the restriction on accessing community water features was devastating to my work. Several of my freelance contracts specifically required regular sampling from retention ponds and community water sources in new developments. I was going to lose thousands of dollars in income because Karen Whitfield had decided to make an example of me. The next few months were a nightmare of petty harassment disguised as rule enforcement. Karen seemed to have made monitoring my family her personal hobby, and I began to realize that her surveillance was far more extensive than I'd initially understood. She had a clear view of my property from her lakefront house, and she seemed to spend an unusual amount of time watching my comings and goings from her front windows. When Emma's friend accidentally left a bicycle on our front lawn overnight, I got a citation for unsightly personal property storage. The fine was $75, and Karen's accompanying note explained that children's toys and recreational equipment could not be left in public view areas for more than 4 hours. When I pointed out that the bicycle belonged to a visiting friend and had only been there for one night, Karen replied that the rule applied to all personal property regardless of ownership. When Miguel's sister visited for a weekend and parked her car on the street instead of our driveway, I got a warning about guest parking violations. Karen explained that guests were required to park in resident driveways whenever possible, and that street parking was limited to 4 hours maximum. She had apparently been tracking my sister-in-law's car and had documented the exact times it was parked on the street. The most absurd citation came when Emma left her soccer cleats on our front porch to dry after a muddy practice. Karen appeared at my door with a violation notice for inappropriate storage of athletic equipment in visible areas. The fine was $100. And Karen's explanation was that athletic gear created an unsightly appearance that lowered property values for the entire community. Every violation came with Karen's sickeningly sweet explanations about maintaining community standards and following established procedures. She'd always include language about how she was sure I understood the importance of rules and how she hoped we could work together to maintain Willow Creek Estate's reputation as a well-managed community. The breaking point came in February, almost 5 months after the fish incident. Emma had been sick with the flu for a week, and I'd been juggling work deadlines with single mom duties, barely sleeping and living on coffee and determination. Our garbage can had been sitting at the curb for an extra day because I'd simply forgotten to bring it in after pickup. Karen appeared at my door at 8 a.m. on a Saturday morning, holding another official citation. This one was for failure to properly store refuse containers within required time frames, and came with a $150 fine. But it was the way she delivered it that finally broke something inside me. Karen stood on my doorstep in her pristine workout clothes, her blonde hair perfect despite the early hour, and smiled as she handed me the citation. She said she was sorry to bother me so early, but she'd noticed my garbage can was still out from Thursday's pickup and wanted to address the violation promptly. When I explained that Emma had been sick and I'd simply forgotten, Karen's smile never wavered. She said she understood that parenting was challenging, but that community standards couldn't be compromised for personal circumstances. She added that she'd noticed I seemed overwhelmed lately and suggested that if I couldn't handle maintaining my property according to HOA standards, perhaps Willow Creek Estates wasn't the right fit for my family. That last comment was delivered with such casual cruelty that I actually felt my vision blur with rage. This woman was threatening to drive me out of my home because my garbage can had sat out an extra day while my daughter was sick. She was using her petty power to punish me for having the audacity to help my neighbor and then daring to challenge her authority. I took the citation without saying a word, closed the door, and sat at my kitchen table shaking with fury. Emma was finally feeling better and was watching cartoons in the living room, completely unaware that some vindictive HOA president was trying to make our lives miserable for sport. That's when I decided Karen Whitfield had picked the wrong person to mess with. See, Karen had made one crucial mistake in her campaign of harassment. She'd assumed I was just another powerless resident who would roll over and take whatever punishment she wanted to dish out. What she didn't know was that my late husband Miguel had been a real estate attorney who'd specialized in property law and HOA disputes. I'd learned more about community association law from dinner table conversations than most people learn in law school. More importantly, Miguel had left me with something Karen couldn't have anticipated: a complete legal library and a network of attorney contacts who'd respected him and were willing to help his widow when she needed it. I spent that weekend doing research that would have made Miguel proud. I pulled every HOA document, every community covenant, every board meeting minute from the past 5 years. I reviewed the original developer agreements, the community charter, and most importantly, the exact legal language of every regulation Karen had used to harass me and other residents. What I found was fascinating. Willow Creek Estates HOA was operating under a charter that gave them very specific powers, but also very specific limitations. More interesting was the fact that several of the regulations Karen had been enforcing weren't actually legally valid according to the community's governing documents. The regulation about unauthorized aquatic animal relocation that had cost me $500? It wasn't in the original community covenants, and there was no record of it being properly voted on and approved by the community as required by law. Karen had essentially made it up and added it to the rulebook without proper authorization. The guest parking restrictions, the refuse container timelines, even the prohibition on feeding waterfowl, none of them had been properly implemented according to the legal requirements for HOA rule changes. Karen had been running the HOA like her personal kingdom, making up rules as she went and banking on residents being too intimidated or uninformed to challenge her. But the really interesting discovery was in the community's original development agreement. Willow Creek Estates had been built on land that included natural wetlands, which meant certain portions of the community were subject to environmental protection regulations that superseded HOA authority. The retention pond wasn't just a decorative water feature, it was part of a protected wetland system that required specific management protocols. As a marine biologist, I was actually legally authorized to take emergency action to protect the wetland ecosystem. Karen's fine for removing invasive species was not only invalid, it was potentially illegal interference with environmental protection activities. Armed with this information, I reached out to David Restrepo, one of Miguel's former colleagues who specialized in HOA law. David was intrigued by what I'd found and agreed to take my case on a contingency basis, partly as a favor to Miguel's memory and partly because he loved taking down power-hungry HOA boards. David reviewed my research and was impressed. He said I'd built a stronger case than most attorneys manage, and that Karen had made so many procedural errors that we could potentially invalidate years of fines and citations. But he also had a suggestion that was far more satisfying than just getting my money back. David explained that under certain circumstances, residents could petition to remove HOA board members for abuse of power or failure to follow proper procedures. If we could document a pattern of invalid rule enforcement and procedural violations, we might be able to force Karen out of the presidency entirely. Even better, David had noticed something in the community charter that Karen had apparently overlooked. The HOA presidency wasn't just an elected position, it came with personal liability for any damages caused by improper enforcement of invalid regulations. If Karen had been fining residents under made-up rules, she could be personally responsible for paying back every penny, plus damages. We spent the next month building our case, and what we discovered was even worse than I'd imagined. David helped me file Freedom of Information requests for all HOA documents and communications, and Karen's own emails revealed a level of vindictive behavior that shocked even my experienced attorney friend. She had been specifically targeting residents she perceived as threats to her authority, and I was apparently at the top of her list. The evidence was overwhelming. Karen had been operating the HOA like a personal dictatorship for years, making up rules, skipping required approval processes, and using her position to harass residents she didn't like. Some of the stories we uncovered were unbelievable. An elderly resident fined $300 for having the wrong shade of mulch, a young couple cited for excessive noise when their newborn baby cried at night, a veteran fined for displaying an American flag that was supposedly 2 inches too large. One particularly disturbing case involved a single mother who'd been fined repeatedly for her children playing too loudly in their own backyard. Karen had sent the woman over $1,500 in citations over 6 months, eventually forcing her to sell her house and move because she couldn't afford the escalating penalties. The woman had never been told she could appeal the fines or challenge their validity. Another resident had been cited for inappropriate landscaping choices because he'd planted native wildflowers instead of traditional grass. Karen had demanded he remove the environmentally beneficial plants and install sod, threatening legal action when he refused. The man had eventually complied, spending thousands of dollars to replace his sustainable garden with water-hungry grass that required constant chemical treatments. But we needed more than just documentation. We needed Karen to make a mistake big enough that the community would turn against her. That opportunity came sooner than expected. In March, Jake's koi pond developed a leak that caused runoff to flow toward the retention pond. As someone who cared about both his fish and the community ecosystem, Jake immediately contacted the HOA to report the situation and request guidance on proper remediation. Karen's response was swift and devastating. She hit Jake with a $1,200 fine for environmental contamination and ordered him to remove his entire pond system within 30 days. She claimed that his pond had always been a violation of community standards and that the leak was proof of his negligent maintenance of unauthorized water features. Jake was crushed. His koi pond wasn't just a hobby, it was his therapy after his divorce, his way of connecting with his teenage son, and his pride and joy. Karen was demanding he destroy something that brought him happiness and peace, all because of an accident that he'd immediately tried to address responsibly. But Karen had made a crucial error. Jake's pond predated his HOA membership by 2 years. It had been installed by the home's previous owner and was explicitly grandfathered under the community's original covenants. Karen couldn't legally force him to remove it, and the fine for environmental contamination was based on another regulation she'd invented without proper approval. More importantly, Karen's heavy-handed response finally woke up the community. Residents who'd been quietly tolerating her petty tyranny suddenly realized that none of them were safe from her arbitrary rulemaking and excessive fines. Jake was well-liked in the neighborhood, and seeing him targeted so viciously made people understand that Karen's power trip could destroy anyone. David and I decided it was time to make our move. We filed a formal complaint with the state's Department of Community Affairs, documenting all of Karen's procedural violations and invalid regulations. We also sent a letter to every resident in Willow Creek Estates, explaining their rights and offering free legal consultation for anyone who'd been improperly fined or harassed. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Dozens of residents came forward with stories of Karen's abuse of power. People who'd been quietly paying invalid fines for months or years suddenly realized they'd been victims of what amounted to an extortion scheme. We organized a special community meeting to address the HOA's management problems. Karen tried to control the meeting, but she was outnumbered and outgunned. David presented our findings to a packed room of angry residents, methodically documenting years of procedural violations and illegal rule enforcement. The evidence was damning. Karen had collected over $30,000 in invalid fines over the past 3 years. She'd made up dozens of regulations without proper approval. She'd selectively enforced rules to punish residents she didn't like while ignoring violations by her friends and allies. When residents demanded answers, Karen's mask finally slipped. She became defensive and hostile, insisting that she'd been trying to maintain community standards and that ungrateful residents didn't appreciate her volunteer service. She accused me of being a troublemaker who was trying to destroy the neighborhood out of spite. That's when I stood up and delivered the speech I'd been rehearsing for months. I calmly explained that I'd never wanted to fight with the HOA. I just wanted to help my neighbor and be left alone to raise my daughter in peace. I detailed every petty harassment, every invalid fine, every abuse of power that Karen had inflicted on me and other residents. But then I revealed the real bombshell. As a marine biologist, I'd been conducting a detailed environmental assessment of the community's water systems. What I'd found was that Karen's landscaping contractor had been dumping chemical runoff into the protected wetland system for over 2 years, a federal environmental crime that could result in massive fines and legal liability for the HOA. Karen's face went white as I explained that her contractor's violations could cost the community hundreds of thousands of dollars in environmental cleanup and federal penalties. The same woman who'd fined me for unauthorized aquatic animal relocation had been overseeing actual environmental crimes that threatened the entire community. The room erupted. Residents who'd been quietly tolerating Karen's tyranny suddenly understood that her mismanagement wasn't just annoying, it was potentially catastrophic for property values and community finances. A motion was immediately made to remove Karen from the HOA board. The vote was 47-3, with only Karen's two closest allies supporting her. Margaret Chen, who'd been Karen's lapdog for years, actually voted to remove her, finally finding the courage to stand up to the bully who'd been terrorizing the community. But removing Karen was just the beginning. David had prepared a comprehensive legal strategy to hold her personally accountable for years of abuse of power. We filed a lawsuit seeking damages for every invalid fine, every procedural violation, and every resident who'd been harassed under Karen's reign of terror. The discovery process was devastating for Karen. Her personal emails revealed a pattern of vindictive behavior and deliberate rulemaking designed to punish residents she didn't like. She'd actually bragged to friends about teaching that marine biologist a lesson and had coordinated with her landscaping contractor to target my property for excessive scrutiny. Faced with overwhelming evidence and potential personal bankruptcy, Karen agreed to a settlement that required her to personally reimburse every invalid fine she'd collected, pay for environmental remediation of the wetland system, and resign from the HOA permanently with a legal agreement never to seek community leadership positions again. The financial impact was severe enough that Karen had to sell her beautiful lakefront house and move out of Willow Creek Estates entirely. Watching her load boxes into a moving truck while avoiding eye contact with the neighbors she'd terrorized for years was one of the most satisfying moments of my life. Jake got to keep his koi pond, along with a formal apology and reimbursement for his invalid fines. The community implemented new oversight procedures to prevent future board abuse, and residents who'd been living in fear of arbitrary harassment finally felt safe in their own neighborhood again. As for me, the new HOA board officially recognized my credentials and appointed me as the community's environmental consultant. I now have permanent authorization to monitor and protect our wetland systems, and I'm paid by the community for work I was doing for free before Karen tried to destroy my livelihood. Emma loves our neighborhood even more now that the angry woman who used to yell at kids for feeding ducks is gone. She started a junior naturalist club with other neighborhood kids, teaching them about pond ecosystems and water conservation. Sometimes I catch her explaining fish behavior to her friends with the same passion I once brought to my graduate research, and I think Miguel would be proud of both of us. The retention pond is healthier than ever, Jake's koi are thriving in their properly maintained home, and Willow Creek Estates has become the kind of community we thought we were moving into, peaceful, supportive, and free from petty tyrants who think power comes from making other people miserable. Karen Whitfield learned the hard way that some people fight back when you push them too far. She picked the wrong neighbor to harass, underestimated the wrong single mom, and messed with the wrong marine biologist. Sometimes the quiet ones are the most dangerous enemies, especially when you give them nothing left to lose. If you're dealing with an HOA bully who thinks they can make up rules and destroy lives without consequences, remember that knowledge is power and documentation is everything. Keep records, know your rights, and never let anyone convince you that their abuse of authority is just following the rules. Sometimes the best revenge is simply holding people accountable for their actions and watching their house of cards collapse under the weight of their own corruption. What would you have done in my situation? Have you ever dealt with an HOA president who thought they owned the neighborhood? Drop your stories in the comments. I love hearing about other people who've stood up to community bullies and won.